So given that Peter was dealing with his COVID this week, what he did manage to do for us was to dig out a sermon that he had originally delivered in 2016 in the Bowling Green Church in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And so this is titled Seeking Peace Amidst Violence. And Peter tells us that some of the references are contemporary with 2016, but I think the message definitely applies today. Chapter 54 of the Tao Te Ching contains these words attributed to Chinese sage Lao Tzu. Cultivate virtue in yourself, and virtue will be real. Cultivate it in the family, and virtue will abound. Cultivate it in the village, and virtue will grow. Cultivate it in the nation, and virtue will be abundant. Cultivate it in the universe, and virtue will be everywhere. The lesson is this: without peace in your heart, there will be no peace in the world. Is there a path that runs from peace in the heart of the individual to peace in the universe? I hope we can devote some thought and some emotion to that today. But the question to start with, it seems to me, is what gets in the way of achieving peace in your heart? That's a question that each of us can ask ourselves, and we should ask ourselves, because we won't find the answer anywhere else. One of the obstacles you may find that gets in the way of attaining a sense of peace is the feeling of fear. Fear of loss, quite often. Fear that you will lose your job, lose your security, lose your transportation, lose the love of your family members, lose a friend, perhaps lose your sobriety or your sense of belonging, lose your direction in life, lose hope. All of these losses have their roots in fear. Another obstacle that gets in the way of attaining peace in your heart is anger. Anger at those who would take away something that you've worked hard for: your reputation, your money, your sense of what is fair and just. Anger that someone is depriving you of your peace of mind even. Here's a piece of wisdom that you already know, but what you might lose sight of. There will be times when you're afraid, and there will be times when you're angry. The questions then become, what will you do with that fear? What will you do with that anger? One choice, and a danger, I might add, is to identify with the anger and to let it guide your actions in harsh words and even blows. You can then justify your anger as the result of what someone has done to you. This is self-justification. Self-justification starts with yourself and ends with yourself and does nothing constructive in terms of addressing the situation that provoked the negative emotion. Unless you think I'm lecturing from a place of superiority, let me assure you, whatever I know of these things comes from experience and self-observation. Again, says Peter. The impulse to take violent action, whether of speech or bodily action, is an impulse to eliminate something that is threatening us or threatening our peace of mind. Looking closely at the interior dynamic, when the emotions are forming, we can gain a clear picture of the elements contributing to that emotional dynamic and make some choices about how to handle them. Is the anger truly and ineluctably us, or is it a passing state, a transitory state? Is it completely real, or at least partially imagined? Is the anger the whole ocean, or a wave on that ocean that too will pass? The popular writer on spiritual topics, Thomas More, says, "There is a virus buried deep in all violence that is contagious, that inspires an equally brutal and mindless response." This also I learned from the talk of a fellow UU minister, Reverend Doug Taylor. A virus buried deep in all violence that is contagious. Strong words. In my experience, true words. It is all too easy for violence to beget violence. And violence starts most often in words. Unkind words, hurtful words, harsh words, damaging, bitter, cutting words. Because we are social creatures, because we are made for relatedness, because we are part of a fabric that has interconnectedness woven into its being, we can't help being hurt by words if we're open to the relatedness which is our nature. Too much hurt, and we tend to shut down or lash out. We may know this is an intellectual way, but lose sight of such truths in the midst of emotional turmoil. Chapter 16 of the Tao Te Ching, empty yourself of everything. Let the mind rest at peace. The 10,000 things rise and fall while the self watches their return. They grow and flourish and then return to the source. Returning to the source is stillness, which is the way of nature. The way of nature is unchanging. Knowing constancy is insight. Not knowing constancy leads to disaster. Knowing constancy, the mind is open. With an open mind, you will be open-hearted. Being open-hearted, you will act royally. Being royal, you will attain the divine. Being divine, you'll be at one with the Tao. Being at one with the Tao is eternal. And though the body dies, the Tao will never pass away. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet speaks of peace in the voice of the Hebrew people. You will keep in perfect peace those whose mind are steadfast because they trust in you. Isaiah 26:3. These teachings are not in conflict. In fact, they express the same truth in different terms. When Isaiah says that those who trust in God will be kept in perfect peace, he uses language that seems to say that God is different from us. But in reality, if God's nature is that of perfect peace, all we need to do is keep in our minds, keep steadfast, and the peace of God will be present. To be steadfast is to be unwavering, watching intently, refusing to be distracted. This is the nature of mind that is achieved through mindfulness. Though few of us achieve such perfect mindfulness as to live in perfect peace, but when it happens, duality vanishes and the perfect unity of God and mind is realized. Mindfulness, of course, is central to Buddhist practice, so we see the three traditions of Taoism, Judaism, and Buddhism coming together in these teachings. The Christian tradition also teaches this truth. This is from Paul's letter to the Colossians 3:15. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. And be thankful. We are members of one body, the human race, in our humanist language. To follow the teachings of Christ leads to peace because the body of Christ and the body of humanity are one. Taoism, Judaism, Buddhism, humanism, Christianity, they all teach that peace is the ultimate goal. And yet with so many religions and so many religious teachings, we find ourselves always living in the midst of violence and asking, why? If peace were the natural state of the world, we would not need religious teachings. It's clear that we have violent impulses. It's clear that we must train our minds and hearts to recognize these violent impulses. We've been trained in other ways as well. We've been trained in a culture of competitiveness. After a Sunday's coffee hour some years back, I made my way to a local sports bar so I could root for my favorite football team in a game that is admittedly, and sometimes it glorifies in it, violent. In addition to the elegance of a well-run pass play, the success of a football team depends on brute force, one body against another at the line of scrimmage. The fullback churning his legs with all the strength he has to force his way through the scrum of bodies united to stop his progress and bring him to the ground. Brutal, primitive, and somehow exciting. How can we reconcile these conflicting desires, one to compete and the other to cooperate? And it's not just in sports. The conflict exists in politics and entertainment as well. You might remember the developments in the so-called race for the presidency in 2016. Developments that included the revelation that one candidate declared a loss of $916 million in 1 year, and the likelihood that allowed him to pay no taxes for 18 years. That one candidate was caught on a tape by a hot mic making comments about the right of men of privilege to treat women as objects for pleasure and dominance. That transcripts from another candidate's speeches to financial investors indicate positions she'd rather not be revealed to the public at large. How are these stories covered in the press? Well, in one online source, the headline of the article featured a video clip that read, "Veteran journalist Bob Schieffer obliterates Trump's surrogate on CNBC panel." Another major news outlet headlines a story this way: "It's time to bury Donald Trump once and for all." The Huffington Post, October 7th, 2016. There are ways to address these issues without the language of violence. For a candidate to succeed in a political election, their positions on issues have to be made clear and stand up to close scrutiny by both experts and the public. But we seem to insist that obliterating and burying are appropriate words to address political differences. And can you distinguish what one person is saying versus another when they talk over each other and shout at each other in what's called a debate? And this is just the first level of violence. We are all very aware of the physical violence against African American men by uniformed police officers in cities across the country. Violence that's been caught on tape and widely disseminated on social media. The goals of the Black Lives Matter movement have been relativized by a competing slogan, "All lives matter," as if pointing out the obvious, that black lives certainly appear to be of less worth when you view how blacks are treated versus how whites are treated for the same crimes, or often for the same behaviors. This diminishes the lives of non-black persons. And yet, another slogan develops, "Blue lives matter," as if demanding justice for those who are unfairly targeted and killed because the lives of police are not valued. And if we don't know that encouraging this polarizing discourse will lead to more violence, we should. And we're acutely aware, or should be, that thousands of Syrian children, refugees from war, were killed in the civil war that the country, as a result of violence, at such a level that whole cities are destroyed and thousands of people killed and more displaced with no new place to go. And Peter comments that we could certainly look at Ukraine today for the same example. This may seem like a far cry from the simple language of violence that we hear and see in the media, but it springs from the same source: personal response to threats, real or imagined, that manifests itself in fear and anger. The question for me is how to respond in my daily life to situations that annoy, frustrate, or anger me. How to respond in a way that's thoughtful and not reactive. In a way that states the truth, as I see the truth, without employing strategies that will lead to divisiveness. And that, in itself, is quite enough to occupy my mental and emotional life. But it is not enough when I recognize myself as part of an interdependent web that I see fragmenting in so many places, in so many ways. What to do? My weekly visits to two inmates at the Warren County Jail provided me with a window into lives that are much more controlled and regimented than mine. Lives lived in close confinement with others, where patience is daily tried, and the arguments are about the rights of men of privilege to treat women as objects for pleasure and dominance. Wow, these pages are out of order. Okay, try that again. Lives lived in close confinement with others where patience is daily tried and the arguments are about and as a way for the guards to assert their power rather than as ways to maintain order. I often find myself congratulating these women for the restraint that they show, the patience and fortitude that they have learned to maintain, not perfectly, of course. Their environment is one where the lines of power are strictly drawn and violence always lurks in the shadows. Even the periodic cell searches and the seizing and disposing of books contains an element of violence. The women are allowed no more than 6 books at a time in their cells, and any more is considered hoarding. These visits enriched my life by broadening my experience. They gave me a chance to provide some words of comfort and sometimes guidance. They provided for the inmates the assurance that someone was willing to spend time with them and cared about them and was invested in their spiritual development. There's a sense of peace that is achieved in virtually every visit. As for the larger social issues, we can reach out to all those we know to reach out in the African American community to offer our support for whatever local efforts are undertaken to advance the message of the Black Lives Matter movement. Regarding the refugee crisis that emerged from the Syrian civil war and elsewhere, Bowling Green, Kentucky helped to resettle 400 refugees in 2016 and 2017, 40 of whom were Syrian. The director of the International Center spoke to our ministerial association about the obstacles confronted by refugees and the procedures that the International Center had in place to help them with their transition to life in Kentucky. How do we seek peace in the midst of violence? I suggest this, that we look closely at not just our own actions, but the thoughts that lead to those actions. And not just the thoughts, but the emotional flare-ups that trigger the thoughts. Monitor the tendency to show off, to be superior in some way, to be unkind when hurt or irritable. Be the peace that you want to see in the world. And get involved. Step out of your comfort zone. See what it feels like to treat another person's child as your own. Feel your pain, and don't use it as an excuse to lash out at the world. And model what it means to be a religion of reason, respect, and reverence. And so I leave you with this question. How do you model peace in a world whose face is often so violent?